1898, portrait resurfaces, and experts. Pale when they spot the mask resting beside the groom. The rain had been falling steadily all morning when Dr. Marcus Wright entered the auction house on Main Street in Branson, Missouri. He shook the water from his umbrella and made his way through the crowded showroom, navigating between clusters of dealers and collectors, examining lots before the sale began. Marcus specialized in Ozark regional history, particularly the volatile period of the 1880s and 1890s, when vigilante groups terrorized rural communities across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. His office at Missouri State University was filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, and court documents detailing the rise and fall of groups like the Bald Knobbers, masked vigilantes who had started as regulators of lawlessness but descended into brutal violence and racial terror. Today's estate auction featured items from the former home of the Whitaker family, longtime residents of Taney County. The house was being sold after the last surviving family member passed away with no heirs. Marcus had come specifically for Lot 32, a collection of vintage photographs and personal documents from the 1890s. The auctioneer's voice droned through the morning as furniture, quilts, and farming equipment sold to various bidders. Marcus waited patiently, his numbered paddle resting on his lap. Finally, Lot 32 was presented, a leather satchel containing approximately 20 photographs, letters, and family records. The bidding started at $40. Marcus raised his paddle at $60. A local antiques dealer bid $75. Marcus countered at $90. The dealer hesitated, then shook his head. Sold to paddle number 47 for $90. Marcus paid and collected his purchase, carrying the satchel to his car. The rain drummed on the roof as he drove back to his office in Springfield. Back at his desk, he locked the door and cleared his workspace. The satchel was well worn, the leather cracked with age. Inside, the photographs were organized in bundles tied with string. Most were typical family portraits from the 1890s, stiff poses, formal dress, unsmiling faces. Then his hands touched a larger photograph wrapped in brown paper. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a wedding portrait mounted on thick cardstock. A young couple stood before a simple backdrop, the groom tall and lean, the bride petite and solemn in a modest white dress. Marcus examined the image under his desk lamp. Then he noticed something that made his breath catch. Partially visible in the groom's coat pocket, as if hastily stuffed there and forgotten, was a piece of fabric. Even in the photograph's sepia tones, Marcus could see it clearly. A crude mask made of white cloth with dark markings that formed horns. A bald knobber mask. Marcus reached for his magnifying glass, his hands trembling slightly. Under magnification, the details became unmistakable. The mask in the groom's pocket was made of white cotton or linen, with two dark horn-like shapes painted or sewn onto the forehead area. The fabric appeared crumpled, hastily concealed, with just enough visible to identify it. The Bald Knobbers had terrorized the Ozarks during the 1880s and 1890s. Originally formed in 1885 by honest citizens trying to bring order to lawless Taney County, the group quickly attracted violent men who used the anonymity of their distinctive horned masks to settle personal grudges, intimidate political opponents, and enforce their own brutal version of justice. By the late 1880s, splinter groups had formed, some descending into pure terrorism, targeting freed slaves, Catholics, and anyone who opposed their authority. Marcus had studied the Bald Knobbers extensively. He had seen drawings and a few surviving examples of their masks in museum collections. The horns were their signature, meant to evoke the devil, to terrify victims in nighttime raids. Members would ride masked through the countryside, whipping men they deemed immoral, burning homes, occasionally committing murder. The movement had largely collapsed by 1889 after several members were hanged for murder, but splinter cells continued operating in remote areas well into the 1890s, their activities unreported and unpunished in communities where fear kept people silent. Marcus turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink on the back, William and Sarah, wedding day, May 7, 1898, Forsyth, Missouri. No last names, just William and Sarah. The date was significant. 1898 was 9 years after the official end of the Bald Knobbers, but rumors persisted of secret groups still operating in isolated hollows and valleys throughout the Ozarks. He scanned the portrait at high resolution. On his computer screen, he zoomed in on the mask. He could see the weave of the fabric, the brush strokes of the dark paint forming the horns. The mask had been shoved into the pocket carelessly, as if the groom had forgotten he was carrying it. Marcus studied the groom's face. William appeared to be in his late 20s, with a lean, hard face and intense eyes. His jaw was set, his posture rigid. He wore a simple dark suit, clean but not expensive. Sarah looked younger, perhaps 20. Her face was pale, her expression difficult to read. Not happy, not sad, but blank, almost resigned. Her hands were folded in her lap, and Marcus noticed she wore no wedding ring. Her dress was plain white cotton, handmade. The setting appeared to be a photography studio, modest and rural. A painted backdrop showed a generic pastoral scene. This was not a wealthy couple. This was a working-class wedding in a small Ozark town. Marcus needed to find out who they were. Forsyth was the county seat of Taney County, ground zero for bald knobber activity in the 1880s. Marcus drove to Forsyth the next morning, a 3-hour journey through winding Ozark roads. The town sat on the White River, a small community that had seen better days before the construction of Bull Shoals Dam in the 1950s flooded the original town site. Many historical records had been lost in that transition. The Taney County Courthouse stood on a hill overlooking the new town. Marcus found the county clerk, a woman named Dorothy who had worked there for 30 years and knew the archives intimately. "Dr. Wright," she said, recognizing him. "Back for more bald knobber research?" "Always," Marcus said, showing her the wedding photograph on his tablet. "I'm trying to identify this couple, William and Sarah, married May 7, 1898, in Forsyth." Dorothy studied the image, then zoomed in on the mask. Her expression changed. "Lord have mercy. That's a knobber mask, plain as day." They went to the records room where marriage licenses were stored in leather-bound volumes. Dorothy pulled the book for 1898 and opened it to May. "Here we are, May 7, 1898. William Thornton married Sarah Elizabeth Dockery. Witnesses were James Thornton and Martha Dockery, probably his brother and her mother." Marcus wrote down the names. "Are there property records for William Thornton?" Dorothy checked her index. "William Thornton appears in the 1900 census, living in Taney County with his wife Sarah. Occupation listed as farmer. They're living in the Bull Creek area, which was pretty isolated back then." "What about after 1900? Dorothy searched through later records. Nothing. No 1910 census entry, no property sales, no death records in Taney County. They just disappear." Marcus felt the familiar chill of a mystery deepening. "Can you check death records more carefully?" Dorothy spent 20 minutes searching. Then she found something. "Wait, here's a death certificate for Sarah Elizabeth Thornton, filed June 1899. Cause of death listed as accidental drowning in Bull Creek. She was 21 years old. What about William? No death record, no remarriage record either, which is strange. Widowers usually remarried quickly." Marcus photographed the death certificate. The details were sparse. Sarah's body had been found in Bull Creek on June 15, 1899, just over a year after her wedding. "Is there a sheriff's report?" Marcus asked. Dorothy pulled out another ledger containing sheriff's reports. She found an entry dated June 16, 1899. "Report of drowning. Sarah Thornton found in Bull Creek by neighbor Henry Walsh. Body recovered approximately 100 yards downstream from Thornton property. Dr. Pritchard examined body, ruled death by drowning. Husband William Thornton states wife went to creek to fetch water and did not return. No signs of foul play observed. Case closed." Marcus read the report carefully. Something felt wrong. She drowned just 100 yards from her own house? In June, when the creeks are usually low? Dorothy met his eyes. "I know what you're thinking. But if the doctor ruled it accidental, there wasn't much anyone could do, especially if William Thornton had connections." Marcus needed to find out more about Sarah's death. The neighbor who found her body, Henry Walsh, might have descendants still living in the area. Dorothy made some calls and found a living descendant, Ruth Walsh, Henry's great-granddaughter, who lived in Branson and was active in the County Historical Society. Marcus called her and explained his research. Ruth agreed to meet him that afternoon at a local diner. She was a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She brought a cardboard box with her. "My great-grandfather Henry kept a journal," she said after they ordered coffee. "When I heard you were asking about the Thornton drowning, I knew I had to show you this." She pulled a worn leather journal from the box and opened it to a page marked with a ribbon. Henry wrote about finding Sarah's body, but he wrote other things too, things he was afraid to tell the sheriff. Marcus read the entry dated June 15, 1899. "Found Sarah Thornton's body in the creek this morning. Poor girl was barely more than a child. I went to the sheriff like I was supposed to, but I didn't tell him everything. I didn't tell him about the bruises on her arms and neck. I didn't tell him that she was wearing her nightdress, not day clothes. I didn't tell him that William showed no grief, just stood there stone-faced. And I sure didn't tell him what my wife Martha saw 2 nights before Sarah died." Marcus looked up at Ruth. "What did Martha see?" Ruth turned to another marked page, dated June 13, 1899. "Martha can't sleep. She keeps talking about what she saw. She was up late with a sick calf when she heard horses on the road. She looked out and saw 5 or 6 men riding past, all wearing those devil masks, white cloth with horns, the bald knobbers. She watched them ride toward the Thornton place. About an hour later, they rode back. Martha swears she recognized one of the horses, belonged to William Thornton. I told her to keep quiet. Those men are dangerous. But now Sarah is dead, and I can't help wondering if those two things are connected. Marcus felt his heart pounding. Your great-grandfather thought the bald knobbers were involved in Sarah's death? Ruth nodded grimly. He never said it outright, probably because he was afraid. But he clearly believed William Thornton was still riding with a knobber group, and that Sarah's death wasn't an accident. Did Henry ever report this? Who would he report it to? The sheriff was likely paid off or too scared to investigate. People learned to keep their mouths shut if they wanted to stay alive. Marcus asked if he could photograph the journal entries. Ruth agreed, then showed him a newspaper clipping from July 1899, a brief obituary. Mrs. Sarah Thornton, age 21, died by accidental drowning. Funeral services private. Private funeral, Ruth said. That was unusual. Most funerals back then were community events. Where's the Thornton family cemetery? Still there, up in the hills off Bull Creek Road. Want me to take you? Marcus absolutely did. Ruth drove Marcus up a winding dirt road that climbed into the hills above Bull Creek. The modern landscape bore little resemblance to how it would have looked in 1899, but this area had remained relatively unchanged, too remote for development. They parked at a locked gate and continued on foot along an overgrown trail. After 15 minutes of hiking through dense oak forest, they reached a clearing on a hillside. A rusty iron fence enclosed about a dozen weathered headstones. Thornton Family Cemetery, Ruth said. Not many people know it's here anymore. Marcus stepped carefully among the graves, reading inscriptions. Most were from the mid to late 1800s, children who died young, adults who rarely lived past 50. Then he found Sarah's grave. The headstone was simple gray granite, smaller than the others. Sarah Elizabeth Dockery Thornton, 1878-1899, beloved wife. Marcus photographed it from several angles, noting the brevity of the inscription. He looked for William Thornton's grave but didn't find one. He's not buried here, Ruth said. According to family records, William Thornton left Taney County sometime in 1900 or 1901. No one knows where he went. Marcus walked the perimeter of the cemetery. Then he noticed something odd, a grave with no headstone, marked only by a rough pile of field stones in the corner farthest from Sarah's plot. Weeds had overgrown it, but the outline was still visible. What's that grave? He asked. Ruth came over to look. I don't know. Could be an unmarked grave, maybe a stillborn child or someone too poor for a proper stone. Marcus knelt and carefully moved some of the weeds aside. The stones were deliberately placed, forming a rectangular border. This was definitely a grave, but whoever was buried here had been deliberately left unmarked. He took photographs, noting the grave's location and dimensions. Something about this felt significant. As they walked back to the car, Ruth said, My great-grandfather wrote one more thing about Sarah. It was in an entry from 1905. He wrote, Still think about that poor Thornton girl sometimes. Wonder if anyone else knows the truth. Suspect there are other victims too, buried in unmarked graves throughout these hills. The knobbers did terrible things, and most of it will never be known. Marcus thought about that unmarked grave. Could it be another victim? Someone else connected to William Thornton's activities? Back at his office that evening, Marcus compiled everything he had learned. William Thornton married Sarah Dockery on May 7, 1898. He was likely an active member of a bald knobber splinter group. Sarah died under suspicious circumstances 13 months after the wedding. William disappeared from Taney County shortly after. The wedding photograph with the mask in William's pocket took on new significance. That mask represented violence, terror, and murder. Sarah, standing beside her husband with that blank, resigned expression, had married a man capable of terrible things. Had she known? Had she discovered the truth too late, after she was already trapped? Marcus needed to learn more about Sarah. Who was she before she married William Thornton? What had led a young woman to marry a man involved with violent vigilantes? He returned to the Taney County records and searched for information about the Dockery family. Sarah's mother, Martha Dockery, had witnessed the wedding. The 1900 census showed Martha living alone as a widow in Forsyth, working as a laundress. There was no mention of Sarah. Marcus found Martha's death certificate from 1912. She had died of pneumonia at age 68. But there was something else in the county records, a probate file from Martha's estate. Among Martha's possessions at the time of her death was one trunk containing personal items and correspondence of deceased daughter Sarah. The trunk had been inherited by Martha's sister, Ada Dockery, who lived in Springfield. Marcus traced Ada's descendants through genealogical records. Her great-great-grandson, Thomas Mitchell, lived in Springfield and was listed as a contributor to the Springfield History Museum. Marcus called him and explained his research. Thomas said, "That's my great-great-great-aunt. Yeah, I've got that trunk. It's been sitting in my attic for probably 30 years. I've never gone through it carefully. Just old clothes and letters mostly. You're welcome to look at it." They arranged to meet the next day. Marcus could barely sleep that night, wondering what Sarah's personal letters might reveal. Thomas's house was a modest ranch in a quiet neighborhood. He led Marcus to the attic and showed him an old steamer trunk covered in dust. "It's all yours. Take your time." Marcus opened the trunk carefully. Inside were folded dresses, a few books, a hairbrush, and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. He put on his cotton gloves and began reading chronologically. The earliest were from 1896, when Sarah was 18. They were letters to her mother while Sarah worked as a domestic servant in Springfield. The tone was cheerful, describing her work and hopes of saving money. Then, in August 1897, the letters changed. "Mother, I have met a gentleman named William Thornton. He is from Taney County and works as a timber cutter. He is very serious and does not smile often, but he has been kind to me. Please write back and tell me what you think." Martha's response was cautious. "Sarah, I do not know this William Thornton or his family. Be careful. Ask him about his people and his character." But Sarah's subsequent letters showed she was determined. By December 1897, "Mother, William has asked me to marry him. He says he has land in Taney County and can provide for me. I know you have concerns, but I am nearly 20 years old, and I do not wish to work as a servant forever." The next letter, from March 1898. "Mother, I am coming home to Forsyth. William and I will marry in May. I know you do not approve, but my mind is made up." There were no letters after the wedding, but there was one final item in the trunk that made Marcus's blood run cold: a small journal, Sarah's diary from 1899. Marcus sat in Thomas's attic, holding Sarah's diary with trembling hands. The cover was simple brown leather, worn at the edges. He opened it carefully, aware that he was about to read the private thoughts of a woman who had been dead for 125 years. The first entry was dated May 10, 1898, 3 days after the wedding. "I am now Mrs. William Thornton. Our wedding was simple, and Mother cried through the whole ceremony. William's brother James was there, and some other men I did not know. They seemed rough and made me uneasy, but William says they are his friends. Our house is small but sturdy. I will work hard to be a good wife." The entries continued through the summer, describing daily life: cooking, cleaning, tending a garden. But Marcus noticed a gradual change in tone. July 20th, 1898. "William was gone for 3 nights this week. He said he was helping neighbors with timber cutting, but he returned very late and would not speak of where he had been. His clothes smelled of smoke and whiskey. When I asked, he told me it was not my concern." August 15th, 1898. "I found something troubling today. While washing William's work clothes, I discovered a piece of white cloth in his coat pocket. It was made into a crude mask with horns painted on it. When I asked him what it was, he became very angry. He snatched it from my hands and told me I must never speak of it to anyone. I am frightened of him when he is angry." September 3rd, 1898. "Men came to the house last night, 5 or 6 of them, all on horses. I heard them talking with William outside. I looked through the window and saw they were wearing masks, white cloth masks like the one I found. They spoke in low voices. William came to bed very late. The next morning I heard that a freedman's cabin near Hollister had been burned. I pray William had nothing to do with it." October 12th, 1898. "I am certain now that William rides with the bald knobbers. He is gone several nights each week and returns with muddy boots and sometimes blood on his clothes. When I asked about the blood, he said he had been hunting. But what man hunts in the middle of the night? I wanted to tell Mother, but I am ashamed and afraid." The entries became more desperate as winter approached. Sarah described her growing isolation. William forbade her from visiting her mother without permission, and he discouraged neighbors from calling. January 8th, 1899. "William struck me today. I had asked him again about where he goes at night, and he hit me across the face. He apologized later and said he was under great strain. He made me promise never to speak to anyone about his activities. I am so frightened. I have nowhere to go." March 22nd, 1899. "I am with child. I have not told William yet. Perhaps a child will change him. Perhaps he will become gentler. I must hope for that." April 30th, 1899. "I told William about the baby. He seemed pleased at first, but then he became very quiet. Later, I heard him talking with his brother James. James said something about too much risk and liabilities. The way they looked at me made me feel like I was a problem to be solved. May 20th, 1899. I lost the baby. I fell down the stairs yesterday. William showed no emotion. I think he may have pushed me, but I cannot be certain. Marcus continued reading Sarah's diary, his hands shaking. The entries after her miscarriage were brief and increasingly frantic. June 10th, 1899. I have decided to leave. I cannot stay here anymore. I have written to Mother and asked her to help me. I will wait until William is gone, and then I will walk to town. It is only 5 miles. I can do it. There was one final entry, dated June 14th, 1899, the day before Sarah's body was found in Bull Creek. William knows I plan to leave. Someone told him about my letter to Mother. He says I will never leave this place. He says I know too much about him and his friends. Tonight he told me we are going for a walk to the creek. He wants to talk about our marriage. I am writing this and hiding it in my trunk before we go. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find this and know the truth. William Thornton is a murderer. He and his masked friends have killed people. I have heard them talking. I have seen things. And now I fear he means to kill me too. If you find this, please tell my mother I loved her, and I am sorry I did not listen to her warnings. Marcus sat in stunned silence, tears running down his face. Sarah had known she was going to die, and she had left this testimony, hoping someone would find it and know the truth. She had been murdered by her husband because she knew too much about his bald knobber activities, and her death had been covered up, ruled an accident. He photographed every page of the diary. He thanked Thomas for access to the trunk and asked permission to share Sarah's diary with historical archives and law enforcement. Thomas agreed immediately. If my aunt was murdered, people should know. Her story deserves to be told. Back at his office, Marcus contacted the Taney County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Jennifer Rodriguez listened with growing interest. "We can't prosecute a dead man," she said. "But we can reopen the case file as a historical investigation. If there are other victims, we should document them. And if the Dockery family wants to pursue having Sarah's death certificate amended to reflect the truth, we can help with that." Sheriff Rodriguez assigned Detective Frank Chen to work with Marcus. Together they reviewed all the evidence: the wedding photograph with the mask, Henry Walsh's journal entries, Sarah's diary, and the suspicious circumstances of her death. Detective Chen said, "The diary is compelling, but we need more. We need to establish that William Thornton was definitively a bald knobber member, and that the group was active in 1899. We need to find evidence of other crimes." Marcus returned to his research, focusing on newspaper archives from 1898 and 1899. He found dozens of articles about unsolved crimes in Taney County: mysterious fires, assaults, disappearances. One article from September 1898 described the burning of a freedman's cabin near Hollister, the same incident Sarah had mentioned in her diary. The article stated that the cabin belonged to Isaiah Washington, a formerly enslaved person who had purchased land. The fire destroyed his home and killed his wife and 2 children. Isaiah survived but left the area. No arrests were made. Marcus found Isaiah's name in census records. He had moved to Kansas City and lived there until 1923. Marcus contacted the Kansas City Historical Society and discovered that Isaiah Washington had given a statement to a black newspaper in 1899, describing the attack on his family. In the statement, Isaiah said, "6 men on horses came in the night. They wore white masks with devil horns. They told me to leave Missouri or they would kill my family. I refused. They set fire to my house while my wife and children were sleeping. I tried to save them, but the flames were too strong. My wife Emma died, and my 2 children, Samuel and Ruth, both burned to death. The law did nothing. The sheriff said he could not prove who did it. But I know who they were: white men who could not stand to see a black man own land and prosper. I left Missouri because I feared for my life, but I will never forget what they did. I will never forget my family's screams." Marcus felt sick. William Thornton and his bald knobber group had murdered Isaiah Washington's family, and Sarah, pregnant and trapped, had known about it. That knowledge had likely signed her death warrant. Detective Chen obtained a warrant to search the Thornton family cemetery. A forensic team was dispatched to examine the unmarked grave Marcus had found. Using ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation, they discovered human remains, a woman's skeleton, buried without a coffin in a shallow grave. Forensic analysis revealed the woman had been in her 30s when she died, sometime in the late 1890s. There were signs of trauma to the skull consistent with blunt force impact. She had been buried hastily, without ceremony. But who was she? Marcus searched through missing persons reports from the 1890s. He found several cases of women who had disappeared from Taney County and surrounding areas during that period. One case stood out, a woman named Rebecca Hayes, age 32, who disappeared in October 1897 after accusing a local man of assault. The man she had accused was never named in the reports, but Marcus found a reference in a church record. Rebecca Hayes had told her pastor that she had been attacked by a gang of masked men who warned her to keep silent about something she had witnessed. Detective Chen worked with genealogists to obtain DNA samples from Rebecca Hayes' descendants. The forensic lab compared the DNA to samples from the remains in the unmarked grave. It was a match. Rebecca Hayes had been murdered and buried in the Thornton family cemetery, likely killed because she had witnessed bald knobber activities and refused to stay silent. The evidence was mounting. William Thornton had been part of a violent vigilante group that committed murder, arson, and terrorism throughout the late 1890s. Sarah had discovered the truth and paid for it with her life. Rebecca Hayes had threatened to expose them and met the same fate. Detective Chen said, "We need to find William Thornton. Even if he's dead, we need to know what happened to him. Did he live out his life peacefully somewhere else? Or did his past catch up with him?" Marcus agreed. Finding out what happened to William Thornton became his obsession. Marcus spent the next month following every lead. He searched census records, death certificates, newspaper archives, and genealogical databases across the United States. William Thornton had vanished from Taney County in 1900 or 1901, but where had he gone? Finally, Marcus found a possible match. A William Thornton listed in the 1910 census in Bakersfield, California, working as a ranch hand. The age and birthplace matched. Marcus contacted the Kern County Historical Society and requested any records related to this William Thornton. What he found was remarkable. In March 1912, a man named William Thornton had been killed in Bakersfield during a confrontation with local law enforcement. According to newspaper reports, Thornton had been involved in a dispute with his employer over wages. When the employer threatened to contact authorities about Thornton's questionable past, Thornton had attacked him with a knife. A deputy sheriff responded and shot Thornton when he refused to surrender. Thornton died at the scene. The newspaper noted that the deceased had no family and left no possessions of value. He will be buried in the county cemetery for indigents. Marcus obtained the death certificate. The physical description matched: height, build, approximate age. But more significantly, the coroner's report noted multiple old scars on back consistent with whipping or severe beating. Marcus knew what those scars likely represented. Men who left the bald knobbers or who were suspected of disloyalty were often whipped as punishment. William Thornton had probably tried to leave the group, been punished, and then fled Missouri to escape further retaliation. He had lived out his final years alone in California, working menial jobs, his past catching up with him in the form of an employer who somehow learned about his history. In the end, William Thornton had died violently, just as he had lived. Detective Chen closed the historical investigation with a comprehensive report. Sarah Elizabeth Dockery Thornton's death certificate was amended to reflect probable homicide rather than accidental drowning. Rebecca Hayes was officially identified as a victim of the bald knobbers, and her remains were given a proper burial with her family. Marcus wrote a detailed academic paper about the case, which was published in the Journal of Ozark Studies. He donated all the evidence: the wedding photograph, Sarah's diary, Henry Walsh's journal, Isaiah Washington's testimony, to the Missouri State Archives. The wedding photograph was exhibited at the Taney County Historical Museum with a full explanation of its significance. Visitors stood before the image, seeing the mask in William's pocket, understanding what it represented: violence, terror, murder, and a young woman's tragic fate. Descendants of Sarah Dockery gathered at her grave for a memorial service. A new headstone was placed with an inscription that told the truth: Sarah Elizabeth Dockery Thornton, 1878-1899. Beloved daughter, murdered for her courage. May she rest in peace. Marcus often visited the museum exhibit, standing before the photograph. He thought about Sarah, who had tried to escape an abusive marriage and paid with her life. He thought about Rebecca Hayes, killed for refusing to stay silent. He thought about Isaiah Washington's family, burned alive because of racial hatred. The bald knobbers had believed their masks would protect them, that anonymity would allow them to commit atrocities without consequence. For decades, they had been right. Fear and complicity had kept their secrets safe. But Sarah's diary had survived. The wedding photograph had survived, with that damning mask visible in William's pocket. Evidence he had carelessly left behind, never imagining it would one day condemn him. In the end, the truth had emerged. It had taken 125 years, but justice, however delayed and incomplete, had finally come for William Thornton and his masked Confederates. Their victims were remembered, their stories told, their suffering acknowledged. And that mask, once a symbol of terror in the darkness, now served as a reminder that no secret stays buried forever, and no crime, no matter how old, is truly beyond the reach of justice.